In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, a hidden invention burned through the harshest of winters, keeping a mountain man alive when no other fire could. For 40 days, it held against nature's fury, changing the course of survival in the mountains forever. This is the story of one man's ingenuity and the fire that never died. Before we dive into this incredible tale of survival and innovation, let us know where you're watching from. If stories of relentless perseverance and forgotten wisdom speak to you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode will bring even more incredible frontier secrets. The bitter winds of the Appalachian Highlands blew fiercely that November, but inside his cabin, Eli Turner felt a strange peace. His small, handmade structure creaked against the gusts, but it was the fire that kept him grounded. The firebox he'd built, just a simple contraption by any other man's measure, had endured through storms that would have extinguished any ordinary flame. For months it had burned without fail, its heat steadily stoking the embers through freezing nights and relentless snow. Yet this night, something in the air told Eli that this was no ordinary winter. As the wind howled, Eli adjusted the fire, his rugged fingers brushing the bricks of the firebox. He could feel the warmth emanating through the stone walls, a comforting reminder of the work he'd put in over the past year. When he'd first come to these mountains, it was with the simple hope of building a life far away from the reach of others, but now his purpose had grown beyond that. This firebox was more than a tool, it was his shield against the wilderness. He had been born in the rough patches of the world, the kind of man who understood how little nature cared for human survival. The mountains were both his adversary and his ally, and he learned early that survival here required more than strength. It demanded an understanding of the land, the weather, and the way fire could be manipulated to fight back against the unforgiving elements. It wasn't just about building warmth, it was about creating something that would last, something that could stand against the storm. Eli stared into the flames, watching as the fire danced, mesmerizing in its stability. His thoughts wandered to the past few months, the months he'd spent perfecting the firebox's design, adjusting it over time to withstand the unpredictable Appalachian winters. It hadn't been easy. He had faced many sleepless nights where the flames sputtered, where the heat waned, and he thought the fire would betray him. But something had clicked when he crafted the box to burn hotter and longer. After weeks of trials, he knew this was the design that would allow him to survive longer than any other settler or trapper could dream of. But his invention was more than just survival. It was the key to something greater, something that would echo through the valleys of the Appalachian Mountains and change the way men lived in the wilds of America. And it all began with a single, desperate winter night, one that would test both his invention and his own will to survive. The firebox had been Eli's obsession since the first real snowstorm of the season, when he realized that he could no longer rely on the basic fire pit he had used in his early years. Every year, the cold crept in, a sharp, biting reminder that the elements could destroy him if he wasn't prepared. He'd watched other men struggle with their fires, feeding them day and night to stave off the cold. Yet, no matter how hard they worked, they couldn't seem to keep the fire alive through the worst of the winter. Fires burned hot, but never long enough to keep the chill away. Eli was determined to change that. His first design was simple: a thick brick box built deep in the corner of his cabin. It was small but made to withstand the heat of an entire night's burn. But he quickly realized that even this wouldn't be enough. The cold seeped into the walls, the floors, the roof, and no amount of firewood would warm the cabin long enough to keep him comfortable through the long, dark nights. Then he had an idea: what if he could make the fire last longer without needing to feed it constantly? His solution was an innovative airflow system, built with metal tubing, that would allow the heat to circulate and keep the firebox burning slowly but steadily. It wasn't just the box that needed adjusting, it was the way air and heat interacted with the fire itself. It took weeks to find the right combination of materials: stone, clay, and iron brackets. The box had to be airtight, yet able to allow for enough ventilation to maintain the fire's strength. Eli's hands were raw from the constant labor, but he was driven by something deeper. Now he wasn't just building a firebox, he was building something that would change the course of his survival. As the weeks passed, the firebox became a fixture in his life. He would sit near it in the evenings, a bowl of stew in his hands, staring into the steady flames. The warmth in the cabin was consistent, unyielding, a constant companion during the long Appalachian nights. He'd worked the design until he was confident it would last, not just for a few days, but through the worst winter the mountains could throw at him. And as the first true blizzard of the season blanketed the land in late December, Eli knew he had finally found the solution he'd been searching for. The cabin, once cold and drafty, was now a sanctuary. The firebox had exceeded all his expectations, burning day after day, night after night, without faltering. It wasn't just a fire, it was a lifeline, one that kept him alive through the coldest months. But Eli wasn't content. No, he had bigger plans. And the fire that burned before him was the key to unlocking those dreams. What had started as a simple survival tool had become something far greater. Eli Turner had crafted a firebox that would endure beyond his lifetime, one that would change the lives of countless others struggling against the harsh Appalachian winters. The days grew shorter as January wrapped the Appalachian Mountains in a blanket of white, and Eli found himself alone in the quiet expanse of snow-covered trees. The firebox continued to burn steadily, a constant in the overwhelming stillness. His cabin, once just a shelter, now felt like a fortress against the harsh world outside. With each passing day, the fire's warmth seemed more precious, more vital. Eli spent his mornings in the forest, chopping wood and checking his traps, but the cold was relentless. The winds would whip through the trees, sending snow swirling in every direction. On some days, it felt as though the mountains themselves were conspiring to test him. But Eli was unshaken. The firebox, his trusted companion, burned steadily in the corner of the cabin, its heat a balm to the bitterness of the world outside. One afternoon, Eli returned to find a fresh layer of snow piled high against his door. The howling wind had shifted, carrying with it the scent of something unusual. He couldn't place it at first, but there was something more than just snow in the air, a subtle shift, a whispering sound. It was the quiet voice of the wilderness, telling him that the next challenge was close. The storm had come quickly, and soon the snow would become heavy, nearly blinding. As Eli prepared to rest for the night, the firebox crackled, its warmth a sharp contrast to the chill outside. Yet the storm outside was more than just an inconvenience. It was a warning. Eli knew that in these mountains, survival depended not only on warmth, but on being prepared for the unexpected. Sitting by the fire, Eli gazed into the dancing flames, feeling the weight of the months ahead. The firebox had given him confidence, but he knew that this season would push him further than he'd ever been. He had crafted a solution for his own survival, but now he wondered how long the wilderness would let him keep his newfound peace. As the snow began to fall heavier, Eli set about securing his cabin. The fire would need to last longer than ever before, and the only way to make sure of that was to keep adding wood, adjusting the air vents, and maintaining the careful balance of heat. It had been a lot of trial and error, but each day that passed made him more certain that this would be the winter that would define his life. His invention, his firebox, had kept the wilderness at bay for weeks. Now, as the storm raged outside, he could feel the mountain's breath just beyond the walls. By the time February arrived, the mountain was a frozen wilderness. Eli had witnessed many storms before, but this one, unlike any other, was relentless. The snow piled so high that even the towering pines were buried beneath a heavy weight of ice and powder. The storm had lasted for days, and the firebox, which had proven its worth over the past weeks, was beginning to show signs of strain. The air in the cabin was still warm, but Eli knew the cold was pushing its way in from the cracks around the door, from the thin walls that had once seemed sufficient. The fire crackled with effort as Eli stoked it one more time, his hands numbing from the frigid air outside. The wind screamed through the trees, and the snow whirled outside the narrow window. There was no sign of letting up. Eli had prepared as best he could, but this storm was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Despite the growing cold that crept in from every corner of the cabin, Eli felt something stir in him, something that had kept him coming back to the mountains season after season. This was the wilderness. The storm was not just an obstacle, it was a challenge. It was a test of his firebox, of his resolve, and of the innovation he had built with his own hands. It was a test of his ability to survive, not just through clever invention, but through patience and fortitude. It wasn't long before the storm revealed its true power. By the second night, the temperatures had dropped so low that the snow itself had begun to freeze, forming a sheet of ice over everything outside the cabin. Eli knew that the firebox would not hold against this much cold for long. But what he hadn't anticipated was just how quickly the wind could shift. A gust, violent and sudden, shook the cabin walls, rattling the roof and causing the carefully stacked firewood in the corner to shift. The air grew colder, and Eli could see his breath. As he stoked the fire once more, his thoughts turned to his original goal. He had designed the firebox to withstand the worst, but now, with the temperature plummeting, he wasn't sure if even his best work would hold up. The wind howled like a wolf outside, and for the first time in weeks, Eli wondered if he had underestimated the mountains. In that moment, Eli knew that he had pushed his invention to the limit, and now it was time to see if it could truly protect him. The firebox had already proved its worth in the days leading up to this moment, but tonight it would be tested like never before. Eli had no choice but to trust his work, and the firebox did not disappoint. It glowed steadily, its heat radiating through the cabin, holding back the mountain's icy grasp, proving that it was indeed built to endure. Outside, the storm continued, but inside the cabin, Eli Turner leaned back against the wall, watching the fire flicker and burn, his faith in his invention unwavering. The mountain may have been relentless, but he had a secret weapon, and as long as that fire burned, he knew he would survive. The storm had raged for over a week, and Eli could feel the weariness creeping into his bones. The relentless winds had done their worst, howling through the trees, slamming against the cabin's walls with the force of nature itself. But inside, the firebox continued to burn. It was the one constant in his life now, a flickering promise that no matter how hard the world outside pushed, he could survive. But even the firebox was beginning to show its strain. The heat it produced was no longer as steady as before. The flames would flicker, and sometimes the air seemed too cold for comfort, no matter how much wood he fed it. Eli had spent the last few days checking every corner of his cabin, reinforcing the door frame, ensuring the chinking between the logs was tight, and replacing the clay mixture where it had cracked in the damp air. But the truth gnawed at him. The mountain was testing him, and this storm was unlike any he had ever faced. Eli had known this was coming. The mountains, for all their beauty, could be brutal. They didn't care if you had built the most ingenious firebox ever conceived, they would break you down if you weren't prepared to face them head on. And that was exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just surviving, he was learning to adapt. Every day that passed in this storm was a lesson, a brutal reminder that innovation was only part of the equation. The rest was grit, patience, and unshakable resolve. One morning, after a particularly violent gust had rattled the windows, Eli noticed something he hadn't before. The snow was beginning to drift against the door in a way that he hadn't expected. The cold was seeping in more rapidly now, and the fire in the box had dropped in temperature. His first instinct was to stoke it more, but something held him back. Instead, he stood by the door, listening carefully to the crackling of the fire. He could hear something else, faint but distinct, the quiet creak of the wood settling, a sound that had once been a comforting part of the cabin's rhythm. But today, it felt different. It was the sound of something trying to break in, and it made his heart race. Eli grabbed his rifle. His eyes scanned the swirling white outside, searching for any sign of movement. He knew that any number of things could threaten him in these mountains, wild animals, other men, or even the land itself. But there was something about this storm, something that felt almost alive. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying a deeper cold, and Eli's breath misted in the air. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not with the storm and the isolation working against him. That's when he realized. This storm was no ordinary blizzard. It wasn't just a test of his firebox, it was a test of everything he had worked for, everything he had endured. By the time the storm reached its peak, Eli had come to one inescapable conclusion. The wilderness was not only testing his firebox, it was testing his resolve. The biting cold, the roaring winds, and the endless snow had stretched on for far too long. But what truly unsettled him was the unease that had settled in his gut. The mountains had a way of speaking, and Eli was beginning to understand that the storm wasn't just nature doing its thing. There was something else out there, something hidden, something he couldn't yet see. Eli had spent countless hours listening to the wilderness. He knew its rhythms, the crackling of ice in the trees, the call of a distant coyote, the rustle of animals moving through the underbrush. But now, those sounds were different. There was an almost unnatural quiet between the gusts of wind, a stillness that was unsettling. The animals had gone silent, the normal signs of life absent. And in their place was a feeling that the mountain had begun to stir, its breath a force he couldn't control. The firebox, though still burning, felt distant now. Eli's focus was no longer solely on the warmth it provided, but on the growing tension he felt in the air. He had heard whispers among the mountain men in town before he had ventured into the hills about the wilderness being alive, about the land having a way of pulling at a man's mind. He had always chalked it up to superstition, but as the storm intensified, he couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen was creeping closer. Late one evening, as the wind howled louder than ever, Eli saw movement in the distance. At first, it was just a shadow among the trees, but as it drew closer, Eli realized it was no animal. It moved with too much purpose. It was a man, and Eli's heart skipped a beat. With the storm intensifying, Eli had no choice but to act. He gathered his gear quickly and silently, moving toward the window. His rifle was ready, his hands steady. Whoever this was, they were no friend. He knew that the wilderness wasn't kind to those who showed weakness, and it sure didn't leave room for error. But as Eli watched the figure move closer, he realized that this wasn't just a random traveler or a lost soul caught in the storm. This was someone who had been watching him, who had been waiting for the right moment to make a move. Eli's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. The mountains had their way of hiding threats, of disguising the true enemy until it was too late. Outside, the storm whipped through the trees, and Eli turned his focus back to the man in the distance. This wasn't just a test of survival anymore. This was a fight for everything he had built, his cabin, his firebox, and his life. As the shadow moved closer, Eli knew that the storm was no longer his biggest threat. The enemy had arrived. The shadow outside his window moved closer, cutting through the snow like a wraith. Eli's heart raced in his chest, his mind scrambling for a plan. The storm outside was reaching its peak, but inside his cabin, the world had gone still. Eli knew this mountain as well as anyone. He knew the dangers it could harbor, but he also understood that every person out there had a purpose. The figure outside wasn't lost, it was coming for him. He quickly checked the firebox, ensuring that the embers were still strong. The last thing he needed was to lose the warmth in the middle of a confrontation. With the rifle in hand, he crouched low, his breath barely making a sound as he edged closer to the window. Through the frosted glass, he could just make out the outline of the figure moving slowly toward his cabin. There was no urgency in the steps, just the steady crunch of boots in the deep snow. Whoever it was, they had been watching him. Eli's mind raced back over the past few weeks. Had he made any mistakes? Had he left a trail or a sign that would lead someone to him? It was unlikely he'd been careful, his path deliberately winding, never straight. But the man outside didn't seem to be in a rush. It was almost as if he knew the storm would keep Eli inside, that the isolation would be his biggest ally. Eli's fingers tightened around the rifle. He had never been one to take chances. The first rule of the mountain was always survival, no exceptions. The second rule, however, was much harder: trust no one. He had lived by that in the mountains for years. It had kept him alive, kept him safe. The figure paused, standing just outside the door now, his shadow pressed against the cabin's walls. Eli's eyes narrowed. The storm howled around them, but in that moment, everything else seemed silent. The figure didn't knock, didn't make a sound except for his breath, which Eli could hear faintly through the cracks in the wood. Whoever this was, they were no stranger to the wilderness. Then, without warning, the man stepped forward and knocked twice, the sound muffled by the swirling snow and the roar of the storm. Eli's breath caught. He had half a mind to stay silent, to wait it out and see if the man would leave, but a small voice inside him told him that would be a mistake. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Eli moved from the window, his fingers still gripping the rifle. He knew he couldn't afford to take chances. He couldn't afford to let this man into his cabin. The firebox was his lifeline, but it would be of no use if his life was taken before he could use it. The knocking came again, louder this time, a sharp, demanding sound that cut through the storm. Eli hesitated, his mind racing. There was no telling what kind of man this was. Could he be another trapper looking for shelter? A lost soul caught in the storm? Or was he someone more dangerous? Someone who had heard whispers of Eli's firebox, of the warmth it could provide, and was now trying to take it from him. Eli took a deep breath and cautiously approached the door, the rifle still at his side. Every instinct told him to be cautious, to wait until the man outside showed his true intentions. But there was no way to know how long this storm would last, and he had already been holed up in his cabin for days. The isolation was starting to play tricks on his mind. He had to make a decision. He had to trust his instincts. He cracked the door open just enough to peer outside. The figure was tall, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide, weather-beaten hat. The storm whipped around him, but he stood firm, unbothered by the snow and wind. Eli's gaze narrowed. This man wasn't afraid of the storm, he was comfortable in it, just like Eli. "I'm not looking for trouble," the stranger said, his voice low but steady, barely audible over the storm's roar. "I've been wandering for days, got caught in this damned storm. I'm just looking for a little shelter, just for the night." Eli didn't lower his rifle. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tension gnawing at him. The man hesitated for a moment before answering. Jack Morgan. I'm a trapper, same as you, just trying to survive out here." Eli wasn't convinced. He had met plenty of trappers in his time, some good, some bad, but something about this man didn't sit right. "How do I know you're not a thief?" Eli asked, his voice colder now. Jack raised his hands in a gesture of peace, showing that he had no weapon in hand. "I'm not here to steal. I've got nothing to steal. I'm just trying to stay alive like everyone else out here." Eli studied him for a long moment. The stranger's clothes were torn, his face covered in a scruffy beard, and his eyes were tired, worn. He had the look of a man who had been on the run for far too long, but something about his demeanor seemed sincere. Or maybe it was the sheer exhaustion in the man's eyes that made Eli pause. "I've got a fire," Eli said slowly, his grip on the rifle loosening. "You can stay, but you'll keep your distance." The stranger nodded, his eyes flicking to the rifle before meeting Eli's gaze again. "I understand. I won't cause trouble. Just need to get out of the storm." Eli stepped back, opening the door wide enough for the man to enter, still keeping his guard up. The storm raged outside, and for the first time in days, Eli felt a strange sense of relief. The stranger may not have been the enemy, but this mountain had a way of hiding dangers, and Eli wasn't about to forget that. As the man stepped inside, the heat from the firebox rushed out to meet him. Jack's eyes widened slightly as he took in the warmth of the cabin, the fire crackling brightly in the corner. "Nice setup you've got here," he said, his voice low but filled with a hint of admiration. Eli said nothing, just watched him closely. The storm raged outside, but inside the tension between them was palpable. Eli had opened the door to shelter Jack from the storm, but he wasn't about to let his guard down. Not yet. Not until he was sure of who this man really was. As the storm continued to batter the cabin, Jack settled into a corner, his eyes constantly scanning the room. Eli didn't trust him, he couldn't. No matter how sincere the man seemed, there was something off about him. Still, Eli had a fire to tend to, and the last thing he needed was to spend the night in isolation again. At least Jack would provide some company, even if he was a stranger. The wind howled louder, and the temperature outside dropped even further. Inside, the firebox burned steady, its warmth filling the room. Eli sat across from Jack, watching him closely. Jack's eyes flickered to the fire, then back to Eli. He seemed more focused on the warmth than the company. "You've got a fine fire there," Jack said quietly, his voice rough from the cold. "Kept me alive through worse storms," Eli replied, his tone guarded. There was a moment of silence between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Jack shifted, uncomfortable. Eli noticed the way the man's hands trembled slightly. the signs of someone who had been out too long in the cold. Eli's mind wandered back to the storm outside. The wilderness was unforgiving, but Jack had survived this far, no easy feat. The firebox, however, had proven its worth time and time again. It had given Eli a sense of security, something he hadn't realized he needed until this moment. Now, he wasn't sure if the stranger was a threat, or if, perhaps, they were both just two souls surviving the same storm. Eli leaned forward, adding another log to the fire. He kept his voice steady. "So, what brings you out here in a storm like this?" Jack hesitated, his eyes shifting to the fire. "I was trapping in the lower hills, got caught in the storm. I didn't expect it to be this bad, but, well, here I am." Eli studied him, the flickering fire reflecting off Jack's weary face. There was a sadness in his eyes, a weariness that spoke of much more than just the storm. Whatever his past, Eli wasn't sure he wanted to know. Jack looked at him finally, meeting his gaze. "I'm not here to cause trouble, just to survive." Eli nodded slowly, his gaze not leaving the stranger. In that moment, he realized that survival was all either of them had. The fire burned between them, casting shadows on the walls, and Eli found himself hoping the storm outside would finally pass. The only thing he knew for sure was that, for better or worse, he wasn't alone anymore. The storm raged through the night, but by the time the first light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the cabin's walls, the howling winds had subsided. The snow, though still thick, had stopped falling as heavily, and a tense silence had settled over the mountains. The worst of it was over. Eli awoke to the low crackle of the firebox still burning strong, the warmth seeping into his bones. Jack was still asleep, slumped in the corner, his hat pulled low over his face. The firelight danced on the walls, creating flickering shadows that made the cabin feel almost alive. The storm had passed, but Eli knew this wasn't over yet. He couldn't let his guard down. He didn't trust Jack completely. Not yet. He stood, stretching the stiffness out of his legs, and walked over to the small window. Outside, the snow lay thick on the ground, but the storm had broken. The mountain, in all its quiet majesty, stood still silent, as though it had witnessed some ancient, forgotten struggle and was waiting for the next chapter. Eli turned back to the fire, adding another log and watching as it ignited with a soft whoosh. The warmth filled the cabin, but it wasn't enough to erase the unease that gnawed at him. Jack stirred from his sleep, rubbing his eyes and looking around. "How long's it been?" Jack asked groggily, his voice rough from the storm. "A couple days," Eli replied. "Storm's over, but it'll take time for the snow to clear." Jack nodded, slowly getting to his feet and walking over to the fire. His movements were stiff, and for a moment, Eli saw the exhaustion in his eyes. There was no question Jack had been through something in the storm. Maybe he had come for shelter, or maybe something more. But Eli wasn't sure yet what to make of it. "I appreciate the shelter," Jack said, his voice sincere, but there was a hint of something else there, something Eli couldn't quite place. "You can stay until the snow clears," Eli said carefully, his gaze fixed on the fire. "But you're on your own after that." Jack didn't argue. He seemed to accept the terms, but there was something in the way he lingered by the fire, as if he was trying to figure Eli out just as much as Eli was trying to figure him out. Eli stood up and walked to the door, pushing it open just enough to let the cold air rush in. The mountain was still there, silent and untamed, waiting for whatever came next. The storm had broken, but Eli knew the real test of survival was just beginning. "Once the snow clears, we'll head out," Eli said over his shoulder. "There's more to survive out there than just the storm." Jack nodded without saying a word, and for a moment, Eli thought he saw a flicker of understanding in the stranger's eyes. Perhaps survival wasn't just about the firebox. After all, it was about the choices they made in the aftermath of the storm, the trust that could either break or be forged in the cold, and the way the wilderness demanded respect. And as the morning light broke through the clouds, Eli knew that the fire would continue to burn, not just in the firebox, but between them, in the shared silence of survival.